Can everybody hear me? You can do a little thumbs up if you need to. Yay, thumbs up. Awesome. Welcome, everybody. I am so excited to have you tonight. Thank you for joining my maternal cannabis webinar. This is my favorite topic, and I have been sitting on mountains of information for years, and I'm now in a place where I'm ready to share it with y'all. And so we're going to jump right in. Tonight, what we're going to do is go through two pieces of research. We're going to bust three myths. And at the end, we're going to have time for questions. So if you have questions during the webinar, just type them into the chat. And then at the end, I'm just going to scroll on back and start answering some of the questions for you. So let me switch screens here. All right. So my name is Christina. I am the founder of 420 Doulas, and I have been an activist for nearly 2 decades, mostly working on the intersections of social justice and environmental justice. But once I became a mommy, I'm a mommy of two. This really shifted my focus on birth justice, and especially where cannabis meets health and criminalization. When I was pregnant with my first child, I was in Maryland at the time, and this was before Maryland was a legal state. And so once I started getting my prenatal care, I was immediately drug tested. I kind of think it was just a part of whatever doctor's office I was in at the time. I wasn't doing much investigation. I was just kind of like being affected by the system. And I got a call from the county nurse after I think it was like my second prenatal appointment. And they told me that I had tested positive for narcotics, which was cannabis. And I was from California. I am from California. So I was like, I'm actually not from your state. I have a medical marijuana card in California. Like, I'm using it medicinally. They were like, well, if you're here and you have your baby here in Maryland, then when you and baby give birth, well, when you give birth to baby, you are going to be tested, and so is the baby. And if I tested positive, and especially if the baby tested positive for cannabis, we were going to have CPS involved in our house. So essentially, from that very first urine sample that I gave in the doctor's office, I was put on cannabis surveillance. So I immediately moved to California, which is not a privilege that many people have. I was super lucky. I packed up myself, my dog, my baby daddy, and I drove from Maryland to California to go live with my mama. And I got a midwife, which was the safest thing for me to do as a cannabis consumer. If you have the funds and you have the access, getting a midwife generally is better because they tend to be way, way friendlier to cannabis medicine. So I spoke with my provider, and she wasn't anti-cannabis. She was very much like, I haven't seen any impacts. And at this time, she had delivered over 1,000 babies. And so she's like, in any of the homes that I've seen cannabis use, I haven't seen any issues with the babies, but I actually don't know anything about it. So while she was not anti-cannabis, she had no information for me. And so this is the reason why 420 Doulas was born. It is the thing I needed when I was pregnant my first round. And I just had another baby. He's 6 months old now. And having my second child here in Georgia really re-sparked that passion for birth and cannabis work. And like I said, 420 Doulas was born out of my desire to create a movement that educates, destigmatizes, and restores autonomy to birthing people and mothers who choose plant medicine. So what is 420 Doulas? 420 Doulas is my baby. It's an educational platform and a community that centers birthing people and mothers who choose plant medicine as a part of their wellness, pregnancy, and postpartum care. This is a very sensitive time for mothers and birthing people, and often this is one of the hardest choices that they make because as a cannabis consumer, having to stop cold turkey, especially if you're a medicinal user, can not only be difficult, it can actually be dangerous when it comes to our health outcomes. So we provide evidence-based education, harm reduction guidance, and compassionate support for parents, doulas, birth workers, and others who want to understand cannabis use in a factual and non-judgmental way. You are never going to hear us judge you for your cannabis consumption here at 420 Doulas. We're here to see you in your consumption and give you the information that you need, the information I needed when I was pregnant my first time. Our mission is to bring balance back to these conversations by replacing stigma with science. We're going to replace fear with facts and the isolation that cannabis consumers use with community. And through webinars just like this, the guides that I have, and the courses, 420 Doulas empowers families, professionals, and helps them to make informed, conscious choices rooted in holistic care, cultural wisdom, and modern research. So, my whole goal this evening with you through this webinar is to bring cannabis harm into proportion. Because when we look to society and what the actual impacts are, the consequences for cannabis consumption and the fear mongering that we experience is completely outsized for the risks that are associated with cannabis consumption. When we talk about cannabis and pregnancy, the conversation is often shaped by fear, old research, and legal stigma. And the number one question families tend to have is cannabis safe? And that's because what we see in our culture, as far as criminalization, punishment, and scare tactics around cannabis, does not match the social narrative it has. That urban narrative that we share with our friends and families. My testimony is I use cannabis for both of my pregnancies, and both of my children are developing really well, happy, healthy children. And so we see this narrative within our communities, but when we look to the culture around us, it is not reflected back. The facts have not been balanced. So many people assume that cannabis causes the same kind of harms that we see with alcohol or opioids during pregnancy. But the evidence does not support this comparison, and that is the whole purpose of the webinar. This webinar is going to help put cannabis harm into perspective. We're going to look at what the research actually shows, what it does not show, and why cannabis exposure is not the same as fetal alcohol syndrome or withdrawal from opioids. The whole goal is to understand the real risks, reduce the fear, and support informed, compassionate care for families. So, before we even go any further into cannabis, it's so important to know and remember that pregnancy itself is not without risks, especially if you are a Black or brown woman. Maternal mortality rates are astronomical in this country. So, even without cannabis, a pregnant body faces unique stresses and complications, many that we already know today, like nausea and vomiting, including hyperemesis gravidarum, which is the extreme version of morning sickness, which can cause malnutrition and dehydration, which have significant documented impacts on fetal growth and fetal outcomes. Gestational hypertension and preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, and sleep disturbances like anxiety, chronic pain, all of which can weaken the body's immunity and put strain on the body. And sleep deprivation is no joke. It actually deteriorates the brain. It has a huge impact on mental health. So when women are not sleeping, when they are not eating, when they are in pain, when they are constantly vomiting, these have huge negative impacts on fetal outcomes and safe pregnancy for mom. So people are choosing cannabis not because it's a cure-all, but because it can reduce some of these things that I just named. They support appetite and food intake when nausea and food aversions are very severe. They help to manage vomiting and maintain hydration. They help to reduce stress, anxiety. And anxiety is an interesting one because the wrong strain on the wrong day will actually induce anxiety. And this is why it's important to have this information about cannabis, its various strains, and what's best for the body. And we all know this, cannabis can offer pain relief, and it also can reduce the reliance on pharmaceuticals, which have their own risk. People are able to transition from opioid addiction by using cannabis as a bridge. So now that all that's been said, it's important to know that cannabis is not the big bad monster in pregnancy that we've all been told it is. It is been blown out of proportion due to racism and propaganda, which is a webinar for another day. So I won't go too far in the rabbit hole, but the three biggest concerns from the research that are always highlighted is low birth weight, there's negative cognitive outcomes, and the third one is that there simply isn't enough research. Tonight, we're going to address all three of these concerns, and we're going to use research to do it. So first off, we're going to get started with low birth weight. This is something that you will see show up in a majority of tests or research that is cited. Many studies say that cite low birth weight as being commonly associated with cannabis use during pregnancy. However, low birth weight can also be attributed to socioeconomic status and other environmental stressors like racism, no access to food, access to poor water, and which often are not fully accounted for in these studies. So when factors such as tobacco use income, and access to prenatal care are actually controlled for, the link between cannabis use and low birth weight is significantly reduced or it disappears altogether. So in 2016, there was a study released called the Maternal Marijuana Use and Adverse Neonatal Outcomes, which was a systematic review and meta-analysis. There were two authors, and the authors performed a search of several databases and searched through data up through August 2015, utilizing PubMed and several other sources. They looked at the observational studies that compared rates of pre-specified adverse neonatal outcomes, meaning low birth weight and preterm labor. And they looked at these outcomes in women who used marijuana during pregnancy and with women who did not. So they had a control group, made sure that the studies had control groups. So when we take a little bit closer look at this review, they included 31 studies and they assessed the effects of maternal marijuana use on adverse neonatal outcomes. The two outcomes that they focused on were low birth weight and preterm delivery. And when they looked at these studies at face value, based on the studies, there was statistical significance suggesting that marijuana users were 15% more likely to experience low birth weight or preterm delivery. However, when the data was adjusted for tobacco use and other confounding factors, a confounding factor is something like income, opioid use, socioeconomic status. When they compared those to other confounding factors, there was no statistically significant increased risk for low birth weight or preterm delivery. And a quote directly from the study, marijuana use during pregnancy is not an independent risk factor for adverse neonatal outcomes after adjusting for confounding factors. Thus, the association between maternal marijuana use and adverse outcomes appears attributable to concomitant tobacco use and other confounding factors. So marijuana is catching heat for low birth weight when it's caused by other factors and has not been independently associated with low birth weight. The next thing is cognitive outcomes. One of the biggest concerns is my child going to be impacted as far as their developmental milestones? Many studies have investigated whether prenatal cannabis exposure affects a child's learning, memory, or attention. However, across decades of research, this is inconsistent and it's often minimal. So when studies control, again, for tobacco use, income, education, and stress, the supported link between cannabis exposure and cognitive impact largely disappears. So most findings show children perform within normal ranges of standardized cognitive tests, even when differences exist. So the next study we're going to look at, it was called the totality of the evidence suggests prenatal cannabis exposure does not lead to cognitive impairments, a systematic and critical review. The authors again conducted a literary search through several literary sources, and they identified studies that examined cognitive performance in offspring exposed to cannabis in utero. To be included in their systematic review, the studies had to assess cognitive consequences quantitatively, and they excluded those that relied solely on questionnaires or brain image data. Again, we'll take a closer look at this study. So 45 studies ended up being included in this systematic review. The sample size ranged from 9 to 538 participants, and this was narrowed down from over 1,600 studies. So out of 1,600 studies, there were only 45 that met the requirements to be included in the systematic review. So they looked at 1,001 statistical comparisons between cannabis exposed and non-exposed groups, and then they measured 104 cognitive outcomes. 1,004 cognitive outcomes. And those cognitive outcomes were across 3 different categories. We have memory and recognition. In this category, they focused on visual recognition and memory, short-term memory, memory subsets, as well as multiple domains of memory. In the second category, they focused on cognitive development and functioning. We looked at reading comprehension, objective assembly, perceptual organization index, spelling scores, design fluency tasks, and executive functioning. And in the last category, they focused on attention and processing. So that was processing speed, reaction time, attention, cognitive flexibility, bimanual coordination task, and interhemispheric transfer. So the participants ranged from 12 months all the way to 22 years. And in the category of 12 months to 24 months, there were 7 studies. And generally, prenatal cannabis exposure was not associated with cognitive performance. However, prenatal exposure was associated with worse performance on 2 cognitive outcomes and better performance on 2 others. In groups 3 through 9 years, they saw that there were prenatal cannabis exposure was significantly associated with 17 cognitive outcomes. So there were better performance on 2 and worse performance on 15. Then we go to our age group of 9 to 12 years. And again, we saw significant association with 12 cognitive outcomes, where better performance was on 4 and worse performance was on 8. And in our last group, the performance on the majority of the 157 cognitive outcomes assessed was similar between the groups. However, prenatal cannabis exposure was associated with better performance on 1 cognitive outcome and worse performance on 9. So when you look at these statistics at face value, it tells us that it looks like when cannabis is involved, when children are exposed to cannabis in utero, there are negative outcomes and more negative outcomes than positive ones. So what we learned was, out of 1,001 statistical comparisons between cannabis exposed and non-exposed groups, prenatal cannabis exposure was associated with worse performance on less than 3.5% of cognitive outcomes. So we would say that that is clinically significant, but 3.5 still feels really small. There's still a problem with these statistics, though. A majority of these results were not compared to normative data, and therefore they failed to demonstrate clinical significance. Excuse me, let me get out of there. So other limitations included small sample size, self-reporting for exposure assessments, and confounding factors like tobacco, alcohol, cocaine, and benzodiazepine use. So when these are controlled for and we compare it to normative data, the stats look very, very different. Despite differences observed in some of these studies, only a small percentage, less than 0.3% of cognitive outcomes, fell below the average range when they were compared to normative data. And normative data is the average Joe, regular schmegular people who are who may have done participated in research studies before. So when we compare it to normative data, there's no clinical significance. This highlights the importance of comparing results to determine the clinical significance of findings accurately. Because currently, I can grab an article anywhere off PubMed and it's going to tell me that there are significant negative impacts. But most of those studies did not control for tobacco use, did not control for socioeconomic status, didn't compare to normative data. And yet that information is what I'm going to find when I Google cannabis in pregnancy or cannabis in breastfeeding. That's why it's so important to go in a little bit deeper with these studies to actually see what they're really saying. So again, when it's not compared to normative data, it looks like 3.5% of all children exposed to cannabis in utero are going to have negative outcomes. But in reality, it is 0.3%, less than 0.3%. And when I am a parent measuring the different things that I'm going to use for my body, cannabis looks a hell of a lot safer than a lot of the things that are currently on the market. And that is a choice that I get to make. So across decades of study, there is no consistent evidence that prenatal cannabis exposure leads to lasting cognitive impairments. Most differences found are small, inconsistent, and often disappear once researchers control for tobacco use, socioeconomic status, and maternal stress. So, the very last monster we're going to tackle about prenatal cannabis is that there's not enough research on cannabis to determine its safety. And plain and simple, that is absolute bullshit. When they say that there's not enough cannabis research around prenatal use, what that really means is that there's no randomized controlled trial funded by a major institution. There's no Western peer reviewed journal article with a pharma friendly conclusion. There's no large longitudinal data set that can be run neatly through statistical software. But that doesn't mean that we have no research, because indigenous and oral knowledge is evidence. It has always been evidence and is what we've used for thousands of years, passed down through text and oral wisdom. Oral traditions that have preserved plant wisdom for millennia, and community-based observations that guided safe birthing long before OBGYNs ever existed. This is evidence. Traditional ecological knowledge rooted in deep relationship with land and body, along with storytelling and lineage-based wisdom, which is the world's first peer-reviewed process, is evidence. Body based knowledge passed through mothers, birthing people, aunties, midwives who know what works because they've seen it, felt it, and lived it. This is evidence. So, and if, urban evidence is not enough, we have ancient knowledge. We have the Vedas and Ayurvedic text. We have traditional Chinese medicine. We have African use, and we can see it globally. Cannabis is used through pregnancy, postpartum, and other ailments. But we'll just look at the Vedas tonight. In the Vedas, it is well documented for its medical use, both therapeutic and balancing, its ritual use in spiritual and ceremonial ways, and also it categorizes its misuses. In the Vedas, cannabis is actually considered a toxic herb. Toxic isn't the same thing that we would think of now. When we use the word toxic, we actually have chlorine in our water. When they're talking toxic, this is something, when overused, it can impair clarity. It can make you lazy, and it just describes what overuse looks like, what excess, poor combination, or wrong doshic states categorized as misuse. None of this is superstition. This is pharmacology, ethics, and energetic medicine wrapped up into one system. So we have the evidence. The modern research doesn't demonstrate any of the harms and risks that I think most parents are super afraid of. I know when I was first consuming cannabis with my first pregnancy, I was actually genuinely concerned about what the consequences could be. My questions were about dosing, about methods of consumption, and no one could answer those questions. They just told me to abstain. So we have it woven into our legal system, we have it woven into our cultures, and we have it woven into our doctor's offices that cannabis is not a viable medicine. In fact, it is such a bad medicine and it's considered a drug that you can go to jail for using it while pregnant or postpartum. So, with that being said, the most significant harms are from the legal system. It is not from the plant itself. It is not from what may or may not happen to your children. It is the systematic removal of children from their homes and the incarceration of birthing people. Between 1986 and 1996, the number of women incarcerated in state prisons for drug offenses increased almost 1,000%, even though national drug use among women actually declined by half during the same period. Between mandatory reporting laws and the war on drug policies, not the drugs themselves, drove the surge, with 2/3 of imprisoned women serving time for nonviolent drug or property offenses. And these policies have devastated families and disproportionately targeted Black and Hispanic women, making criminalization, not cannabis, the greatest source of harm. When I have to talk with a family about what are the risks when we consume cannabis, well, the biggest risk to you is whether or not you're going to end up under cannabis surveillance and whether or not CPS is going to become involved in your family and your household. Excuse me. So cannabis has essentially become another tool used to continue the legacy of legal kidnapping in this country. Black and brown people have always had our children taken from us in this country. And cannabis just helps continue that legacy by flagging families as unfit parents and removing children based on perceived harm, not statistical or factual harm. The Black and brown families are facing, and underprivileged families as well, face child endangerment, mandatory reporting, custody loss, and medical intervention. In some states, using cannabis during pregnancy can lead to charges of child endangerment and loss of custody. There is no danger to children when their parents consume cannabis medicinally for ailments that they would otherwise not be able to treat. Mandatory reporting is something that happens in healthcare offices. Healthcare professionals in many states are mandated to report substance use during pregnancy to Child Protective Services. So, in my case in Maryland, I was reported. I'm assuming that they took my urine, they tested it for THC metabolites, and then said, yes, this person has tested positive for narcotics. And then I just went into the surveillance system because of mandatory reporting laws. And in some cases, cannabis use during pregnancy can be used against individuals in custody battles, potentially affecting child custody arrangements. And in our communities, we will even weaponize this against the other parent and say they're consuming cannabis because we know that it's a nail in the coffin when it comes to custody. And in some states, they may be required to undergo substance abuse treatment programs or counseling as part of legal proceedings or child welfare interventions. And this affects individuals disproportionately between arrest rates, prosecution and sentencing, and child welfare involvement. Black and brown women are more likely to be arrested for cannabis related offenses, including use during pregnancy, compared to white women. Data from various sources, including law enforcement agencies and advocacy organizations, have shown that Black and Hispanic individuals are disproportionately represented in cannabis related arrests and prosecutions. And once they're arrested, Black and brown women may face harsher prosecution and sentencing outcomes compared to their white counterparts. And this can result in longer prison sentences, heavier fines, and other legal penalties, including the loss of parental rights. And pregnant women of color who use cannabis may also be more likely to come into contact with child welfare agencies, which leads to increased surveillance, interventions, and potential removal of their children from their home. This involvement can have long-lasting and detrimental effects on families, exacerbating existing racial disparities in child welfare systems. So when we talk about cannabis risk and harm, the first part of the conversation has to be, what are the legal risks in your state? Where are you the safest to be consuming cannabis? How do you navigate the system and ensure that you're not drug tested, or that you're clean when you are drug tested, and that you quit by your third trimester? It's honestly a big hassle that many folks just choose to discontinue their cannabis use. But there is a major gap between the research, the law, and the public understanding, and this gap is massive. And this is exactly why this work exists. This is exactly why I'm hosting webinars like this, to essentially politicize folks just like you to see that cannabis, again, is not the big bad monster in pregnancy that we've been told it is. Between cannabis propaganda, big pharma, and the legal system and racial disparities, cannabis never had a chance. So how do we address this gap in education? So I'm going to stop there and say that I'm super excited because I have been, like I said at the beginning of the webinar, I've been sitting on so much information from the past 4 years of doing research and educating myself. And I finally have synthesized it into Understanding Maternal Cannabis. It is my baby. It is a 40-page guide that I created just for you, for birth workers, for folks who consume cannabis while pregnant and postpartum. And what it covers is understanding prenatal cannabis. We dig into what it looks like when you consume in the body, methods of consumption. So depending on how you consume cannabis, it's going to have different effects. And I think most of us know that just regularly, like when you smoke, it's going to feel different than if you consume edibles. But we deep dive into why and how we can mitigate some of the risks associated with different methods of consumption. And then we move into a dosing guide, which actually helps you look at how much cannabis your body actually might need, how much is too much, and how you dose across different methods of consumption. And then finally, we talk about breastfeeding because this is so important to a lot of birthing people who are body feeding. Does cannabis transfer into breast milk? Yes, it does. And we talk through that in this ebook, Understanding Maternal Cannabis. I've also added some extra resources like the risk ranking and the 1 week cannabis journal. I've also created a community so that way I can take everything that's in my brain and on my computer and put it in a place that it can actually be useful for you. I have guides on how to talk to your provider. I have guides on hydration and cannabis use. Cannabis is a drying herb, and what herbs do you want to pair with that if you are consuming cannabis while pregnancy? Hydration is like one of the number one important things for a pregnant body. So I created the Patreon space so that way you could have access to me, the research, and everything that I find. Is kind of just my place that I bury away information for you. And if you join the community and you join the premium tier, you actually get the maternal, Understanding Maternal Cannabis Guide for free. Currently, it's on my website for $45, but you can go in there and get it for free at the premium tier, and then it's at a discount rate when you choose another tier. But when you join, you become a part of a movement that is decolonizing maternal health education. The 420 Doulas Patreon offers deeper learning, ongoing research. I'm building a research library in there for you. Most of the articles that I write have research attached to them. So if you're someone who likes to deep dive like me, you have all those resources. And this is a space for you to have collective dialogue around cannabis safety and reproductive justice. And if all of that is not enough for you to feel like you are behind the scenes of changing the stigma around cannabis education, then you can actually sign up for my waiting list. I'm hosting a 3-month educational experience with 420 Doulas. This is our cannabis informed birth. It is a 3-month educational experience where we have 2 classes every month, and we dig into topics that you find in the prenatal or the maternal cannabis guide, but it really kind of gives you that extra information. It's very different to read a book versus having discussion with others. Anyways, that is all that I have for you this evening. So if you want to stay connected, join the Patreon. If you want more information about prenatal cannabis and how to use it or how to speak with your patients or clients, get the 40-page maternal cannabis guide. And if you want a longer form education and you want to have a certificate of completion as a cannabis informed birth worker, join the waiting list. So I will stop there, and I'm going to go back to my dashboard so I can see any questions. You're welcome to come off mute, raise your hand, and yeah, any questions, folks? If you're on mute, I cannot hear you. If you're talking anyways, I can't hear you. Well, if there are no more questions, you will receive an email from me tomorrow. It's going to have the replay of this. But I'm also realizing that I did not record it on here, but I did record it on another device. So I actually have to now marry the two, the webinar and the video. So give me 48 hours to send the replay out to you. You'll also get a link to my ebook, as well as a link to the Patreon and a link to the cohort waiting list. So if that is all, I am so thankful that we got to share space together this evening, and I'm available to you. You can find me on Instagram in the DMs. You have my email if you have questions, and the Patreon is a great place. We are going to be hosting live webinars just like this once a month, every second Saturday. So if you want more education and you want to dive deeper into the research and other topics, the Patreon again is a great space. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I hope y'all have a great evening.